and also the participation of the private sector to drive progress. And for us, that is really so important, that Africa has got so much potential that it offers to the world. I mean, there's...
Across Africa's Sahel region, a stretch of land often associated with poverty, conflict, and instability, something unusual is unfolding. Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso are three countries that, for years, have been described as fragile, dependent, and incapable of managing their own economic systems. International institutions, foreign governments, and major media outlets have repeated the same idea for decades. Without Western financial control, these countries cannot function. That belief shaped everything: their currencies, their loans, and even how their resources were sold to the world. But recently, these three nations made a decision that directly challenges that entire narrative. Instead of relying on existing global financial structures, they began building their own, a regional banking and investment system designed to operate outside traditional Western control. This move didn't come with global headlines or dramatic announcements, yet its implications are enormous, because once countries start controlling their own money, they start controlling their future, and that is where this story truly begins. But what did they do? Let's find out. To understand why what Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso are doing today is so dangerous to the old order, we first need to rewind and talk about something most people were never taught to question. For decades, Africa's economic story has been told in a very specific way. You've heard it before, even if no one ever said it outright. Africa is poor because it is mismanaged. Africa struggles because it lacks expertise. Africa fails because its leaders don't understand economics. The solution, we were told, was always the same: external guidance, foreign banks, foreign currencies, foreign institutions. That story became so normal that it stopped sounding like propaganda and started sounding like common sense. But here's the part that never quite added up. Africa is not poor in resources. It is not poor in labor. It is not poor in land. In fact, the Sahel region alone produces enormous quantities of gold, cotton, livestock, food crops, and strategic minerals. People work, farmers grow, miners extract, goods move. Value is created every single day. Yet despite all of that activity, poverty remains stubbornly high. Not just temporary hardship, but generational poverty, the kind that survives good harvests, survives high commodity prices, survives decades of development projects. At some point, you have to stop asking what Africans are doing wrong and start asking whether the system itself is working exactly as intended. Take a simple example. A farmer in Mali grows cotton. The farmer sells that cotton cheaply because prices are not set locally. They are set on global markets, influenced by traders who have never seen Malian soil. The farmer borrows money to plant next season, but the loan comes with crushing interest. By the time the harvest is sold and the loan is repaid, almost nothing is left. Multiply that story by millions of people across multiple countries over decades. Now zoom out to the state level. When governments need money to build roads, hospitals, and power plants, they don't print it. They borrow it. And they don't borrow from neighbors. They borrow from global institutions that come with rules. Those rules decide which projects are allowed, who executes them, and how the money circulates. The result is a strange cycle. Money enters African countries briefly, then leaves again just as fast. Infrastructure remains, but profits do not. Debt stays. Control stays elsewhere. This is why, despite independence on paper, monetary sovereignty never truly arrived. Currencies remained tied to foreign systems. Budgets remained constrained by foreign approval. Development remained conditional. And this is the context most discussions conveniently skip. When Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso began questioning this arrangement, it wasn't a rebellion. It was arithmetic. It was pattern recognition. It was the realization that no matter how hard they worked within the existing framework, the outcome never changed. So the issue was never that Africa couldn't manage money. The real issue was that Africa was never allowed to control it, which leads directly to the next question. If the problem was control, how exactly did global financial systems maintain that control for so long without it looking like coercion? The answer is uncomfortable, because it doesn't involve tanks, soldiers, or direct force. It involves contracts, interest rates, and institutions that present themselves as neutral and benevolent. Control was built into the system itself. For most African countries, access to money has never been a matter of choice. When governments need funding for roads, hospitals, power plants, or agriculture, there are very few doors to knock on. The IMF and the World Bank dominate that space. And while these institutions speak the language of development, the mechanics of how their money works tell a different story. When a loan is approved, it is never just money. It is a set of conditions. These conditions decide what kind of project is acceptable, how it must be implemented, and, most critically, who is allowed to implement it. In theory, this is about reducing risk. In practice, it ensures that the money cycles back to the same economies that issued it. A government may borrow billions to build infrastructure, but the construction contracts often go to foreign firms. Engineering, project management, consulting, and procurement handled externally. The salaries are paid abroad. Equipment is imported. Large portions of the loan never circulate inside the borrowing country at all. What remains is debt and infrastructure that rarely generate enough revenue to repay it. And when repayment falls short, the consequences are not abstract. Collateral clauses come into effect. Resource-backed guarantees are triggered. Export rights are locked in. Minerals, oil, and agricultural commodities become tied to repayment schedules negotiated years earlier under pressure. This is how value quietly flows outward. The system doesn't need to openly seize resources. It only needs to price risk in a way that ensures African borrowers pay more for money than Western countries ever do. Interest rates for African states are often many times higher than those offered to rich countries borrowing from the same institutions. The justification is risk. The result is a permanent disadvantage. Over time, this creates a trap. Countries borrow to develop. Development fails to generate enough revenue, more borrowing follows. And each cycle deepens dependency. What makes this system particularly powerful is how invisible it is to ordinary people. There is no single villain, no dramatic moment of loss, just a slow erosion of control disguised as assistance. And this is why the shock of sanctions in 2022 and 2023 hit differently for Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Sanctions didn't create a crisis. They revealed one that already existed. They stripped away the illusion of partnership and replaced it with a clear message. Access to money is conditional on obedience. At that moment, the question changed. It was no longer about how to survive within the system. It became about whether survival was even possible under it. Which leads to the turning point. When sanctions closed familiar doors, what alternative did these countries begin to seriously consider for the first time? They began to consider something most countries are trained never to consider seriously. What if the alternative didn't already exist and had to be built from scratch? When sanctions hit, the immediate expectation was collapse. That is how the global system is supposed to work. Cut access to finance, restrict trade channels, isolate currencies, and pressure forces to comply. It has worked many times before. But in the Sahel, something different happened. Instead of panicking, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso compared notes. They looked at their shared geography, shared history, and shared constraints, and realized something quietly radical. Individually, they were vulnerable. Together, they were not insignificant. Combined, they controlled vast territory, strategic resources, and a large population that still produced real value every day. That realization changed the conversation. For decades, African financial integration had been discussed as a future goal. Endless meetings, endless communiques. ECOWAS talked about a common currency for nearly 30 years without delivering one. The idea was always framed as too complex, too risky, too premature. But complexity looks different when the existing system stops functioning. The Sahel states did not begin by announcing a currency or declaring independence from global finance. That would have been symbolic and fragile. Instead, they focused on foundations, the parts of a financial system that determine whether a state can breathe under pressure. First came the idea of a stabilization mechanism, a financial buffer designed to help member states absorb shocks, sanctions, commodity price swings, and supply disruptions without immediately collapsing into crisis. This alone was a major shift because it reduced dependence on emergency lending from outside institutions. Then came the investment question. Rather than borrowing externally for every major project, they began designing a regional investment bank, one that could pool resources, finance infrastructure, agriculture, and manufacturing, and make decisions based on regional priorities rather than foreign conditionalities. Not a charity, not aid. A bank with a development mandate rooted in local realities. And finally came the most sensitive topic of all, money itself. Currencies are not just tools of exchange, they are tools of control. Whoever controls issuance, valuation, and convertibility controls economic breathing room. The Sahel states understood this deeply. As long as their economies operated through systems they did not control, every policy decision remained vulnerable. So instead of rushing toward a single announcement, they began laying the groundwork for something more durable, a shared monetary framework that could eventually support internal trade, reduce dollar dependence, and weaken the leverage of sanctions. What made this moment different from past attempts was not ideology. It was urgent. There was no illusion that permission would be granted, no expectation of applause, just the understanding that waiting longer would change nothing. The system they were exiting had decades to prove itself. It had failed to deliver sovereignty, prosperity, or stability. And that is when something even more unexpected occurred. As this new financial architecture began to take shape quietly, a country that had always stood firmly inside the old system started leaning toward the new one. Which raises the next question. Why did Togo, a long-standing Western ally, decide this was a future worth joining? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because Togo saw something others missed. This wasn't chaos forming, it was order being rebuilt. For decades, Togo had played its role exactly as expected. It was a stable coastal state, deeply embedded in ECOWAS, cooperative with Western partners, and host to major development programs. It was never grouped with the Sahel's troubled interior. From the outside, there was no obvious reason for it to look elsewhere. But geopolitics isn't driven by appearances. It's driven by incentives. As Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso began constructing their own financial institutions, they weren't just insulating themselves from sanctions, they were quietly creating gravity, a center of decision-making that didn't answer to Paris, Brussels, or Washington. And gravity pulls. Togo's leadership understood something fundamental. The future of West African trade does not belong exclusively to coastal states or external partners. It belongs to whoever controls the flow between inland production and global markets. And the Sahel states control production. Gold from Mali, uranium from Niger, agriculture and labor from Burkina Faso. These are not marginal assets, they are strategic. For decades, they moved outward through channels designed by others. But now, those producers were reorganizing themselves, and any coastal country that aligned early would gain enormous leverage. That is where Togo's calculation changed. Rather than viewing the Sahel alliance as a risk, Togo began seeing it as an opportunity. Not ideological, not emotional, strategic. By aligning with an emerging inland bloc, Togo could reposition itself from a passive transit state into an indispensable gateway. And the key to that transformation sits on its coastline. Togo controls the deepest port in West Africa, a port capable of handling the largest cargo ships currently in operation, and those expected in the next generation of global shipping. This is not a technical detail, it is a structural advantage. Ports decide who trades efficiently and who pays extra. They decide shipping routes, insurance costs, turnaround times, and ultimately profitability. For landlocked economies, access to a reliable port is not a convenience, it is survival. By leaning toward the Sahel Alliance, Togo wasn't offering charity, it was offering alignment. In return, it stood to gain priority access to inland markets, resource flows, logistics hubs, customs revenue, and long-term relevance in a rapidly shifting regional order. This move also carried a deeper signal. For the first time, a country firmly embedded in the traditional West African institutional framework was acknowledging, quietly but clearly, that those institutions no longer reflected where power was actually moving. ECOWAS had promised integration for decades. The Sahel states were delivering it in real time, and that realization unsettled more than regional planners. Because when a reliable insider begins hedging toward a new system, it suggests that the old one is losing credibility not just among its critics, but among its beneficiaries. Which leads to the question that now hangs over every financial center watching this unfold. If this alliance is gaining strategic depth, economic logic, and regional allies, what exactly are global powers afraid might happen next if it succeeds? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Because what global financial centers fear most is not that this experiment will collapse, but that it might work. If the Sahel Alliance failed quickly, it would confirm every old stereotype. Headlines would write themselves. Warnings would feel justified. Silence would turn into lectures. The system would absorb the shock and move on. But success is a different threat entirely. What Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and now Togo are building is not a rebellion. It is a template. And templates spread quietly, not through speeches, but through results. At the core of this new architecture is something deeply unsettling to established power: control returning to producers. A banking system that does not treat African economies as high risk by default. An investment framework that finances agriculture, manufacturing, and infrastructure based on local logic, not foreign credit ratings. And most critically, a monetary direction that reduces dependence on currencies and payment systems controlled elsewhere. This is why Western media coverage has been so cautious, often absent. If 3 European states formed a new central bank outside existing financial structures, it would dominate headlines for weeks. When African states do it, the story is minimized, delayed, or framed as instability. Silence in this case is not ignorance, it is containment. Behind the scenes, analysts understand what is at stake. If regional trade within the Sahel begins to function using locally controlled financial tools, demand for external financing decreases. If investment decisions are made internally, leverage through conditional lending weakens. If resource-backed financial instruments stabilize currencies, speculative pressure loses effectiveness. And once one region demonstrates that this is possible, others begin to ask dangerous questions. Why must we borrow at higher rates than richer countries from the same institutions? Why must our commodities be priced abroad while risk stays at home? Why does development always require permission? This is where contagion begins. Guinea holds some of the world's largest bauxite reserves. Ghana produces gold at scale. Other inland and coastal states watch closely, not with ideology, but with calculation. Because joining late means adapting to someone else's rules, and joining early means helping write them. This is why pressure will increase. Expect narratives about instability, warnings about investor confidence, predictions of collapse. These are not neutral assessments. They are tools. The same tools are used whenever control begins to slip quietly. But there is a deeper irony here. For decades, African leaders were told integration was the solution. Unity was encouraged, so long as it remained symbolic, slow, and externally supervised. The moment unity becomes functional and self-directed, it becomes threatening. And that contradiction reveals the truth beneath the rhetoric. This system was never meant to empower African economies to choose freely. It was meant to manage them. Which brings us to the final unavoidable question. If real independence has never been granted, only taken, what happens when African nations stop asking for space and start building it themselves? Because when nations stop asking for space and start building it themselves, the rules of the game quietly change. History is very clear on this point. No one has ever gained real independence by operating forever inside systems designed by others. Those systems are not broken by accident. They are structured to extract, manage, and limit. Reform is allowed only as long as it does not threaten control. The moment it does, resistance appears. What Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and now Togo are doing fits a pattern older than modern finance. They are not rejecting cooperation. They are rejecting subordination. They are not isolating themselves from the world. They are redefining how they engage with it. This is why the most important part of this story is not gold reserves, ports, or banks. It is a mindset. For the first time in generations, African states are acting on the understanding that dignity in economics works the same way it does in politics. It cannot be granted, it must be exercised. And exercising it means building institutions that reflect your own priorities, even when the cost is pressure, criticism, or isolation. The Sahel Alliance knows the road ahead is not smooth. There will be economic stress. There will be attempts to divide the bloc. There will be narratives designed to discourage others from following. That is not speculation, it is precedent. But something irreversible has already happened. A proof of concept now exists, not in theory, in practice. An alliance that chose coordination over compliance. Institutions built without permission. A coastal partner that aligned not out of desperation, but foresight. And once people see that another way is possible, even imperfectly, obedience becomes harder to enforce. This is how systems really change, not through announcements, but through imitation, not through speeches, but through results. Quietly at first, then all at once. Other countries are watching. Some cautiously, some skeptically, some with growing interest. Because the question this alliance raises is uncomfortable but unavoidable. If control over money determines development, then why should that control live permanently outside Africa? That question does not belong only to the Sahel. It belongs to every region that produces value but captures little of it. Every nation that exports wealth and imports dependency. Every society is told to wait patiently while its future is negotiated elsewhere. Whether this experiment succeeds fully or faces setbacks, one thing is already true. The old story has been broken. The idea that African nations are incapable of designing and managing their own economic destiny no longer holds. The rest of the world now has a choice. Continue pretending this isn't happening, or prepare for a future where Africa is no longer managed, but negotiating. And that leaves us with the final question, the one that will define the next decade. When more countries realize they don't need permission to build their own systems, will the world adapt or resist until adaptation is forced? Let us know in the comments section. Should the world accept Africa as a leader? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.